Again, my name is Charles Enciso, and I'm joined by fellow Master Gardener Marsha Cook. And we are presenting on supporting wildlife with California native plants. And we just want to thank you all for being here this afternoon to hear us speak about this topic that we both really care about. And we want to thank Shirley for the invitation to speak with you all. I'm going to share my screen. Wonderful. So you should be at this point seeing my screen supporting wildlife with California native plants. All right, and we'll introduce ourselves, and we'll ask Marsha to start.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. My name is Marsha Cook. I'm a native San Diegan. I grew up in Lemon Grove. I have a bachelor's of science degree from San Diego State University in biology. And I also enjoyed about a 30-year program with the county working in watershed protection. In 2010, I was given the opportunity to become a master composter, and at that time also got to meet several master gardeners. So I made it my mission that if I ever got to retire, I would become a master gardener, and I have enjoyed doing that. So in 2018, joined the class of 2018 Master Gardeners and have really enjoyed the people I've met and the opportunities that has afforded. I am a lazy gardener, so I really enjoy gardening with native plants. And I live in a very rural area, so I enjoy bird watching and seeing what insects and other animals come into my yard based on what is planted.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marsha. And again, my name is Charles Enciso. I am also a native San Diegan. I grew up in Spring Valley, not too far from where Marsha grew up. I also attended San Diego State University and earned a bachelor's degree in biology with an emphasis in zoology and environmental studies. And then from there, I went off and I joined the Peace Corps. I served as an environmental education volunteer in the South Pacific, which led me on a 25-year-long career in managing volunteer programs. I'm currently the director of volunteers at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and really enjoying my work here. It's been a wonderful confluence of my science background and my background in managing volunteer programs, and so I'm really loving it here. My interest. I have some training in landscape design and really interested in ways that we can incorporate natives in an aesthetically pleasing landscape design that really supports wildlife needs. And so, Marsha and I put this presentation together a few years ago. We're constantly adapting it to address what the continuing adapting science and evolving science, and we're really happy to present this all to you.
So as some of you may know, the UCSD is the group that supports Master Gardeners. So through the UC Cooperative Extension, the Master Gardeners program was developed to allow volunteers to be trained on scientifically based information to assist the public with their gardening home needs. The program is a fairly extensive training, and the mission of the program is to educate the public, answer questions, and try to provide resources and information to benefit the home gardeners.
Wonderful. So why don't we jump right into this topic that you're all here to learn about and to discuss, the idea of landscaping with native plants to support wildlife. And so, this presentation will cover a lot of it's going to be introductory because we don't know where everyone's experience is at, but there will be an opportunity at the end to ask some specific questions as well. And so when we talk about, what wildlife needs, first and foremost, we talk about food, right? And then providing wildlife, the kind of wildlife that you're interested in attracting to your yard, the type of food that it needs. So if you're interested in pollinators, and obviously you want to plant many flowering plants. And then if you're interested in other animals, thinking about the food sources for those animals. Water, cannot underscore the importance of water, particularly here in Southern California, and the availability of a consistent, reliable water supply. If you have a water supply that is available, the animals in your area will flock to it, and particularly if it is accessible and consistent. The idea of habitat security. And Bev had asked a question a little bit earlier about pets. The idea being, if you have a yard that's big enough, or even using, kind of strategic ways of designing your yard so that the wildlife areas are secure, so that there are parts of your yard that your domestic animals, like your cats and your dogs, are not able to access, that would be most ideal. So the idea of kind of cordoning off portions of your yards so that the animals are safe and secure in those areas. And then the idea of when you're thinking about your garden and the design and what you put in your garden, taking into consideration what the animals that you're trying to attract need in the areas of housing and reproduction. I mean, this is a picture of a mourning dove. If you're familiar with mourning doves, they will breed pretty much anywhere. And this is a mourning dove that created a nest in a hanging basket. But thinking again about those kinds of things, when you think about carpenter bees, for example, making sure that you have access to wood areas or piles of wood where they might be able to then create their holes and reproduce. And so these four areas are really the things you need to consider when you think about what your wildlife would need in your garden and what you would need to make available for them if you want to successfully attract them to your garden. I want to give you this example. This is actually my backyard. My backyard had a pool that was retired back in 2008 when we had all of those fires. It kind of killed our pump. And every year, if we got enough rains, I would have to pump that water out. Eventually, I decided, you know what, I'm going to see what I can do about turning this pool into something a little bit more wildlife friendly. It is ideal because, it has that it slopes to the deeper area, so it's a really safe water source for birds. And over time, I was able to turn that pool into a really fun little pond experiment that I've continued to work on. So, I've got some lilies in there. I've got some irises, native and non-native, some water hibiscus, some other grasses that I'm experimenting with. And this was my view, actually, from when I was working at home during the pandemic. And I can tell you, it has become a significant wildlife area in my backyard. And when you think about all of the things that we talked about, the things that wildlife needs, because it's a pool by law, it has to be fenced, and so none of our dogs are able to access it. And all day long, I was able to watch birds access this pond for water and for food. So that's an example of something that was once kind of a trouble area in my yard that has since become a really beautiful wildlife area.
Okay, so why native plants? Well, the native plants and animals have kind of evolved together. We have, this photo shows a European honeybee coming in for some pollen on a Matilahaw poppy, but we have several hundred species of native bees, and they've grown up with the plants that we have locally here. So they've evolved together and developed relationships that work for both the plants and the animals. The native plants supply the animals with needs. Some of the shrubs can provide roosting areas, some of the trees roosting areas for birds, and so on. Native plants also have adapted to the region based on the water availability, not irrigation necessarily, but in low-lying areas, some riparian areas have trees and plants that are accustomed to having water availability. The different soils the plants have adapted to some of our rocky or clay soils, sandy soils, and so on. Some grow better in sun, some grow better in shade, some can tolerate both of those. And then the temperatures. Native plants have evolved in the West here to be able to tolerate some temperatures. With some changes to that, there may be some changes in the future that we may not be able to predict, but certainly the areas where the plants have developed and grown are evolving and have evolved together.
Right. And then another thing to point out, if you're someone who is very interested in attracting birds and supporting our local bird wildlife, the Smithsonian did a study that links the suburban backyard in the presence of non-native plants to a decline in our native songbirds. Per this article, the suggestion was 70% of a landscaped yard should include natives if you intend to adequately support songbirds in your yard. So 70%.
All right, so now we'll go into the different microclimate zones in our county. So as you hear on the evening news, the county does have 4 different zones of climate. So the coastal zone, which has the marine influence, we do see coastal fog. I think yesterday was a really good example of that. If you're around the coast, you saw the severe amount of marine influence with that fog. We do have inland areas. Those areas have greater temperature changes from night to daytime. So plants in those areas can adapt to that. The mountains are often holding or blocking airflow. And so plants and air and things growing in those areas do have a range of up to 77 degrees in the daytime highs, and lows about 45 degrees through most of the year. The mountains also can get light snowfall several times a year in San Diego, and in some years we get a lot of snow. So it does, has to tolerate the frost through those times. And then the desert areas, of course, San Diego's Anza Borrego Desert does have minimal rainfall, sandy soils. Summers are extremely hot. A lot of people actually leave the area during the summer to avoid that heat. But, the plants stay, the plants are there, and it's hot summers, and they have grown to adapt to that.
Right. And so when you think about the climate zones, our plant communities have adapted to those specific zones that they're in. This area of Southern California and Baja California is one of the most, botanically speaking, at least, diverse areas in the world in regards to, going from the coast all the way out to the desert and through our foothills, our inland valleys, foothills, and mountains. And we do have some areas, the riparian habitats, the boggy areas, where, again, widely diverse array of native plants. And for a gardener and horticulturist, just a lot of beautiful plants that would fit very, very well into a garden. We wanted to show you this map, the plant community map of San Diego. This is a relatively recent map, and what I want to highlight on this is kind of those areas of pink, right? Those pink areas are areas that are kind of developed here in San Diego now. And so these are kind of the more urban suburban areas where the non-native vegetation has replaced our native vegetation. You can still see that out in the foothills and the mountains, you still have a lot of the native vegetation, and then there are still patches, and you can identify these patches if you're familiar with San Diego as kind of, where the native vegetation persists and endure. You look up north and you recognize that Camp Pendleton has become a very, very important conservation area in regards to our native plants. And you can see that it's, the last coastal community that is undeveloped. And so again, really important in that little bit over there in Point Loma. And so again, really important for you to kind of see how there are areas in San Diego that are, and primarily on the fringes of San Diego, that are still quite native with these patches of undeveloped areas.
So for your considerations for where you live and for your specific yard needs, there are planting considerations that need to be taken into effect. If you're on a north-facing slope, you may have cooler and more humid conditions than if you're on a south-facing slope. So even within your own yard, you have these microclimates. So you have to take into consideration which plants are going to thrive in sun. If you have sandy or clay soils, which plants will thrive in those areas? Or maybe you have a rocky terrain or an area that you have grown vegetables with a really rich biological soil. You need to take those things into consideration for planting for native plants if you choose to take that path. The water availability, most native plants do need to be established when they're first planted. And so you can't just depend on sticking a stick in the ground and having it grow. You do have to water to get them established. And then depending on the plants, either irrigate or provide them some supplemental water. There are a few exceptions. Some plants don't like supplemental water throughout the summer. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those. The space, some plants like to be crowded in. Maybe they like to grow under the shade of other plants. Some like to have their roots interspersed with other plants. And those would be companion plantings that you can look for both at the nursery and in some of the resources that we'll provide to you today. Your topography, if you have a slope and you're planting on a slope, there's a lot of options for that versus being on a flat ground. The elevation, what area you're in is going to have an impact on how those plants grow and thrive. And then also temperatures, the afternoon sun. In my yard, I've got a specific area that has a really difficult time because the heat beats down on the west side of my house and reflects that heat back onto the planted areas. So it's very difficult to grow plants that are not super hardy. Okay.
Thank you, Marsha. And one of the things I wanted to point out about this picture and about this yard design, again, thinking about design and aesthetics, a lot of the plants in this yard are native, and you look at their hardscape, right? I mean, and this is an important thing for you all to consider if you're thinking about kind of changing your landscape to accommodate more natives. You look at the hardscape, you see that it allows for water perforation, and it's not a solid asphalt or concrete driveway. It's these pavers that will allow for water to seep in. You look at kind of their walkways, they're gravel or decomposed granite. It is a very, very well designed natural landscape that suits these plants in it, like the scrub oaks and the Cleveland sage that are in that landscape. All right, so we've talked a lot about kind of things that you need to consider when you're thinking about planting native plants, or maybe changing your garden landscape to include more native plants and attract animals. And we do want to recommend some plants, some specific plants for you to consider. Okay, all of these plants are native to Southern California. They're going to be relatively easy for you to find, relatively easy to grow, kind of throughout San Diego. And we selected a group of plants that are really aligned with the principles of good landscape design, all season interest, with focal points, backbones, and things that are aesthetically pleasing to look at. I think, early on, when people talk about native landscaping, one of the knocks against it was, a lot of our plants, our native plants here in Southern California, tend to go dormant during the summer. And you've probably, noticed this, right? I mean, during the summer, our natural landscape is pretty dry, pretty brown. And, you see that in kind of some earlier designs of native plants where, somebody's front yard looked entirely dead during the summer, and then, the fall rains and winter rains would come and it would look great in the spring. And so what we're presenting here and giving you suggestions of are some plants that either kind of maintain an all-season interest, or plants that that do not go dormant as significantly during the summer.
Okay, so the first one is our California state flower, the Escholzia californica. Now, I originally thought this was an annual, and Charles and I argued about it, and I said it's an annual, and he said they grow perennially in my yard. Well, I plant seed, and so I plant them as annuals, and then I usually don't see them return. But I am in a really dry climate, a dry area, where they probably don't have enough moisture over the summer to maintain that taproot that they grow. But this is our state flower, the California golden poppy. The photo shows the beautiful orange, and you can see that on a lot of hillsides on the years when we have a lot of rain. We've had some super blooms over the last 4 to 6 years, I think, and they are pretty spectacular to see. You can purchase seeds for these. They are kind of a waxy pale green color plant with yellow to orange flowers. The flower on the left, that yellowish color, is one that's in my yard. And I show that because not all of the plants that bloom will be that brilliant orange. So be prepared if you're going to plant these. You may have a yellow to orange bloom, but I think they're beautiful no matter how things go. Now, these do bloom typically from February to September, and it is a great flower for California. Now, this is the flower that beat out the Matilaha poppy for our California state flower. It does attract birds and small herbivores. Bees and butterflies and other pollinators enjoy this flower as well through the blooming time. So this is one of our top picks for flowering. And they are self-seeding. And if you do cut them back, not remove the plant, but cut them back, and your conditions are right, you will get that perennial bloom and growth the next year.
All right, and I will talk about the milkweed. So we have several native milkweeds here in San Diego and Southern California. The narrowleaf milkweed being one of them. Milkweed is, a lot of people are familiar with milkweed, the tropical milkweed, which many people who are concerned about monarch butterflies have planted in their yards. We are suggesting that people in San Diego plant the native milkweeds instead. Though if I will say planting any milkweed is actually supporting the monarch butterflies, but we do support the native milkweed instead. It is a beautiful plant. It grows 3 feet tall, 1 foot wide. If you're fortunate enough, this is one of those plants, right? If you're fortunate enough to have attracted monarchs, and the monarchs decide to lay their eggs on your milkweed, then the monarchs are going to eat that thing down to the stems. And so it's not going to be very attractive, but you are doing your part to support the monarch butterfly here. They have a beautiful seed pod that kind of at the end of the season will burst, and you see these beautiful milkweed seeds kind of dispersed throughout your yard. And so they will self-seed, though you can also collect those and plant them and then have them ready to kind of transplant into your garden again the following year. I will explain, and so, you know, native monarchs thrive on milkweed, and they actually need milkweed to reproduce. Environmentalists suggest that you plant the native milkweed, and we suggest this as well, because the native milkweed will die back at the end of the season. And we want that to happen so that the monarchs will move on. What has happened with this proliferation of the tropical milkweed is that it's confused the monarchs. The milkweed is here perennially. It doesn't die back the way the native milkweed does. There's also a parasite that can sometimes persist on these milkweeds that don't die back, that can sometimes affect the monarchs. And so this is why we suggest the native milkweed instead. And it's quite beautiful. And the blossoms, as you can see here, are this light pink, whereas the tropical milkweed has these bright red and orange blossoms.
So the next flower is of the mimulus variety. The red bush monkey flower is a plant that we do suggest. This plant is an important source of food for hummingbirds, and it also attracts many pollinators. Now, this plant is it's a shrub that grows to about 2 feet tall. In spring, it does have dark green leaves and a long-lasting red trumpet-shaped flower. Now, the flowers can also be yellow or orange, depending on the variety that you choose. And this is one of the plants that any additional watering in the summertime can cause problems for the plant. I've killed many a monkey flower plant in my yard by overwatering. And so I want to warn you not to overwater this plant. Now, the plant on the left is in my yard and it doesn't look great. It has a lot of dry branches and leaves on it, but it does continue to flower, so I leave it there. And like I said, I'm a lazy gardener, so I don't always trim back what I should. But the birds and the bees and the pollinators enjoy it, and so I leave it there. Now, the monkey flower is one of the plants. I know probably not all of you have a large yard where you can plant native plants, but the mimulus varieties are plants that have been recommended as container plants. The one thing you need to make sure of is that you provide adequate drainage. You do not want these flowers, these plants, having their feet standing in ponded water in a pot. It needs to have a very well drainage, excellent drainage, so that they don't end up with root rot. So that's an important aspect for this. And one of the resources that I've found was from the Rancho Santa Ana Botanical Garden in terracotta pots, and they're quite lovely in spring. And they do trim them back, and so they look much more beautiful than what I've presented to you here on the left.
And just a little, from an environmental educator perspective, the monkey flower has a touch-sensitive pistil, which is this little thing right there. I've got my cursor on it, and so if you touch it, it'll close, and that's a really fun thing. I love to show to young children. They just kind of love to see that. And again, that's an adaptation for their primary pollinators, which I believe are our local bumblebees, and where they will, where they will assume that they've been fertilized, and then they'll close, and if they haven't been, then they'll open up again the next day. All right, Cleveland sage is one of my favorites, my local favorites. I have a big Cleveland sage in my front yard, and I absolutely love it. It's actually named after Daniel Cleveland, who was one of the founders of the San Diego Natural History Museum. I talk about that often during my volunteer orientations, and who was a botanist. It is a wonderful native sage. It's kind of a mounding habit, so it can get quite big, though you can cut it back pretty severely, and it'll grow back. And so, it talks about up to 8 foot in diameter. you can actually cut your Cleveland sage annually to keep it about 3 feet or 4 feet wide. And so, and it takes really well to kind of maintenance like that, which is, you don't often see in our native plants. And so it's a really great plant for a garden. Really strong smelling leaves and flowers, and beautiful flowers that attract pollinators, in particular hummingbirds, which kind of frequent the sage. And a wonderful smell in the evenings as well. So it's just a great plant to have in your yard. Once they're established, you hardly ever want to water it. It does not, like the monkey flower, it just doesn't like a lot of water. And again, when we think about our drying environment, one more argument to consider native plants. And then at the end of the season, when you let those flowers then go to seed, those seeds will fall and are quite attractive to a lot of our native birds. I think you saw in one of those earlier slides, the introductory slides, that I am an aviculturist. I do keep California quail, and my California quail love the seeds of my Cleveland sage.
Okay, next up is the California buckwheat, and there are several varieties of buckwheat. The ones in the photos here show how beautiful the little pom-pom shaped varieties can be. It's a very hardy and drought tolerant plant. These species do prefer full sun. They do grow between 3 and 5 feet tall, and they can spread significantly up to 6 or 7 feet across. So if you're planting one of these, be sure that you leave room for this plant to expand, because it will. The flower rusty color in the late summer and early fall. Lower right shows some very rusty colored blooms that had maybe started out as the lighter colors of the pinks or the whites. There's some varieties that open flat top on it, sort of a Queen Anne's lace type of look to it. And some have the more compact kind of pom-pom shapes on the top of the stems. But the flowers do attract insects that are seeking pollen, and the seeds do provide food for birds and rabbits. They do dry up in the fall. I have to say, the ones in my yard are not pretty in the fall. I don't irrigate regularly, and so we do have to cut them back. But each year they come back. They are perennial, and they will pop right back up with fresh new growth and fresh, beautiful blooms.
All right, so lemonade berry, Rhus integrifolia. This is actually one of my favorite native plants. You see it quite frequently if you're driving along any of our freeways or any of the canyons. You'll probably note the lemonade berry. It's evergreen, which is one of the things that I love about it, and it's quite hardy. Once it's established, requires no watering at all, beyond kind of the water that it gets from our very meager rainfalls. It is kind of pretty common throughout San Diego. As you get into the higher elevations, the lemonade berry is replaced by the sugar bush, Rhus ovata, which tends to do a little bit better in those higher elevations. And so you see those kind of, as you get up into the foothills, it'll change to that species. Beautiful, small, tiny little flowers, but where it gets its name are its berries. You can see it in that picture there. These berries, they produce kind of like a sap that surrounds the berries, which is quite acidic. And the story goes that the indigenous people in Southern California would kind of soak the berries in water and drink that water, which is why it's called lemonade berry. and it's you know, and you can do that as well if you wanted to. It is like I said, because it's evergreen. It's a significant plant as far as our native birds. It provides a lot of kind of shelter and nesting for our native birds, and it does really well on steep banks as well. So it's an excellent stabilizer for our banks. So again, for many of us here, you know, San Diego has this kind of hilly topography. This is an ideal plant for San Diego.
Okay, next up is the Ceanothus, California lilac. So California lilac is a group of plants. There are many different varieties that are perennials. They are evergreen, but they do, in unirrigated areas, they do tend to dry out. It's a kind of a small tree or a dense shrub. It can get up to 10 to 18 feet tall without being pruned. So if you decide to grow one and you want to keep it lower, you will have to prune to keep that down. It also can grow up to 5 to 10 feet wide. So again, be careful when you're planting some of these Ceanothus varieties that you give it plenty of area. Now, some of them have been crossbred and hybrid to become smaller, low-growing shrubs, and they are very pretty. They range from this purplish color that you see here to blue and white flowers, and they are really beautiful plants when they're blooming. In some of the neighborhoods in Ramona, we can look up a hillside and see it just is really beautiful lavender color as they're starting to bloom and coming out. It is extremely drought tolerant and requires very little care, including water once they're established. So if you plant one of these and you start it with a drip irrigation system, you would want to reduce that drip to almost nothing as the plant establishes itself. It is a plant that can grow in full sun to part shade, and it is very fragrant. I think it's one of the most beautiful California natives. The lilac is a favored habitat for warblers because it is such dense foliage. It's hard for their predators to get in there, and it's really easy for them to hide inside this foliage. And I have had some success breaking sticks off and sticking them in the ground to get a new plant to start. Although I don't recommend that as a propagation technique, but I have had some success with that with California lilac. So it's a nice one.
Wonderful, thank you. The toyon is one of my favorites as well. The California holly or hollyberry, as it's known. Again, it's one of those foundation shrubs, though it can get quite tree-like as well. It's perennial, it's evergreen, it's woody, can get up to 10 feet tall. So, you know, not a tree per se, but quite big for a shrub. But again, you know, the toyon and the lemonade berry that I had discussed earlier actually deal quite well with pruning. And so while, you know, we always want you to consider placement when you think about putting these in your yard, also know that many of them can also, you know, will also deal very well with kind of being maintained. It is a beautiful, beautiful plant. It has beautiful dentate leaves and these white flower clusters that then become these really bright red clusters of red berries that are actually kind of starting to red out right now. And so, you know, during the Christmas season, this is one of the red berried plants that you'll notice if you ever go out hiking in any of our canyons. Interesting, you know, bit of information. Hollywood was actually named after this shrub because of those Hollywood hillsides were covered in hollyberry. And again, you know, like a lot of the other plants that we've discussed, once you have gotten them established, the care for them is very, very low. They take care of themselves, require very little in regards to maintenance and water. And again, these berries are what make them so special and why we recommend them. And for a lot of the local berry eating songbirds like mockingbirds and waxwings, you'll see them on these bushes during the winter. And then a lot of our omnivorous large mammals here, the coyote and bears in particular. You know, if you see coyote scat in the late winter, you're probably going to see some Hollywood berries in that coyote scat.
Okay, and most of you probably recognize the Manzanita based on the beautiful color of this trunk and stems. So this is a favorite. It is an evergreen shrub that typically grows as a multi-trunking shrub or small tree. It does have very hardy wood stems, and it has that bright mahogany red color to it. So I think a lot of people that I've seen growing Manzanita trim up the foliage so that you can enjoy seeing the beautiful trunks underneath. The flowers and berries are edible. The name translates to little apple. And many of these varieties can thrive in pots. So if you don't have a large area and you want to plant a Manzanita, you could put one in a pot. Again, it needs to have that very good drainage. It needs really excellent drainage. And you want to have another thing I didn't mention for the other plants that you might want to try to grow in a pot is that they do need to sort of have an insulation barrier around them. You wouldn't want to set these out just in a black pot. The heat of the summers, even though you're watering them on a more regular basis and allowing for drainage than you would if they were in the ground, the heat from our summer, hot weather can kill the small roots in these plants when they're potted. So if you do pot them, put them into some kind of a container that's then surrounded by gravel and another container so that there's a heat barrier there, that the sun is not just beating down onto plant containers and causing those young tiny roots to be killed from the heat. So, all right.
Thank you. And you know what, everyone? I just noticed that there's a whole lot of activity going on in the chat, and let's make sure that we get to that as well, okay? When we finish this, and we're getting close to being done. I think this is the only tree that we recommend, the coast live oak. And honestly, you have to have quite a yard if you're going to accommodate a coast live oak. They get quite big, as you can see. 40 to 50 feet high, 30 feet wide, very, very long-lived tree. There's some amazing hikes here in San Diego where you can go and see some big, beautiful, mature oaks. And so, we wanted to recommend it though, because the live oak in particular, and the other oak here, the black oak, I mean, they're really important food sources for so many of the animals here in California, and they're just and so if you have the space to install a live oak, we strongly encourage that you do so. I think future generations are going to appreciate your efforts in putting an oak in. This is one of my favorite trees here in Southern California. All right, so, and this is going to get to a little bit of what Julie was talking about in the chat. Why have we come together to talk about, planting wildlife and supporting wildlife, and why do Marsha and I come together and speak to so many groups about it, and why do we feel that it's so important? So let's talk about the concept of fragmentation, okay? The idea of, in our very, very developed urban parts of San Diego, because of the way development has occurred, what has happened is we have promoted what's known as fragmentation, wildlife fragmentation, right? The idea being that because of neighborhoods and freeways and things like that, what has happened is we've created essentially these wildlife islands, right? We have created a situation where even though wildlife persists in these areas, and you look at this map, and if you're familiar with San Diego, you recognize all these areas, right? You see Tecolote Canyon, you see the western side of Point Loma, you see that southern side of the 8, the area around here at the in Balboa Park. You know, these we're blessed, right, to have these canyons here in San Diego, which has provided areas still for wildlife. But what has happened is these wildlife areas have become cut off from each other. And you know, if you're familiar with kind of genetics and the way that all works, you know that the wildlife needs to interact in order to maintain kind of strong wild communities. But currently these communities are not able to interact because of the fragmentation that the development here in Southern California has caused. And you know, and we've seen kind of the tragic results of it. I mean, all of us have seen examples of roadkill here in California, and you know, and you've asked that possum why it tried to cross the freeway, and it tried to cross the freeway to get to other areas, and it was unsuccessful. And so our hope and our goal is to promote, you know, these local homeowners creating wildlife-friendly spaces in their gardens, not only to kind of promote and support wildlife in their gardens, but kind of when you look at the larger picture, when you look at perhaps creating a movement of local gardeners creating wildlife-safe habitat, then the idea of creating wildlife corridors. And so let me explain that concept to you if you don't understand, if you're not familiar with the idea of wildlife corridors. I'll go back to this last slide actually. You know, the idea being, you know, back when I was a student at San Diego State, one of the local groups that I was involved in had an acronym. I don't think they exist anymore, but they had an acronym called PALS, which stood for People Against the Los Angelesification, which isn't even a word, of San Diego. And one of their big programs was really trying to, this was back in the late 80s when they were really thinking about closing a lot of the military bases here. And the idea being, you know, let's do everything we can to not develop and to not close down Camp Pendleton, because we've already recognized that it's in a very, very valuable conservation area. And then the idea of, you know, could we have this coast-to-coast corridor, wildlife corridor that stretched from North County down through the mountains and then back down to the ocean down in southern San Diego. Now we've seen here already that all of that development that's happened in Chula Vista, that this corridor has now stopped east of the ocean here. But again, the idea being kind of the importance of having areas that wildlife can traverse safely. So again, when we look at this, the concept of wildlife corridors here, we can even look at it at a macro level, you know, and I chose an example of you know, Old Town, and kind of walk you through this idea. You know, let's say, you know, you had one house, and that yellow square represents a household. Let's say you have one house that, you know, really kind of bought into the idea of creating a wildlife-friendly yard. And that house went ahead and did that. But one house alone is while impactful, you know, could be much more impactful if other people did it. And let's say, you know, they talked to their neighbor, and their neighbor was like, you know what, I think that's a really good idea. I'm going to do that in my yard as well. And the second person, actually being a person who, you know, is really active in the neighborhood and really strongly promoted that concept, managed to then convince a few other people to kind of do the same and approach their yard and their landscape in the same way. And all of a sudden, through the efforts of a neighborhood, what you've done is you've created a wildlife corridor, and you've created safe passage, safer passage for wildlife from one kind of area to another in these two areas that had been previously unconnected and disconnected. So the idea being, what if you could create these wildlife corridors? What if you could, in some really strategic neighborhoods, create kind of wildlife-friendly gardens that supported wildlife and created safe spaces for wildlife. You can conceivably, connect Old Town through, through those finger canyons off the southern side of the 8 to Pioneer Park as well, through the efforts of not a whole lot of people, right? And so this is one of the things that we're really trying to promote through our discussions, the fact that, you would be doing individually what you could to help our wildlife, but then as a community could have an even stronger impact on our wildlife.
So one of the programs that the Master Gardeners have put together, I think it started in about 2014, was the concept of doing an earth-friendly gardening principle. And although this principle doesn't only include use of native plants, it includes other ways of gardening that can promote earth-friendly type of activities. It's selecting the appropriate plants for the right location, nurturing the soil to make sure that you have what the plant needs. Also practicing responsible pest management, possibly eliminating the use of pesticides or herbicides in your yard. Protecting wildlife is another area, keeping cats indoors, or as Charles mentioned earlier, cordoning off areas where birds and animals, wildlife can be safe in your yard, free from cats or dogs. Conserving water and protecting water quality, so watching your runoff so that you don't have any. Conserving energy or protecting air quality by maybe using a clothesline rather than your clothes dryer. Also reducing waste by composting or using organic materials in your yard rather than sending it to the landfill. And even such a simple thing as growing your own food. So these concepts put together the idea of earth-friendly gardening, and what that does is it can start a conversation with your neighbors. So if you're interested in following the earth-friendly gardening principles, you can go online and take a survey at the link that is on the slide. You can, if you meet all of the minimum criteria, you can print a document that is a certificate congratulating you on your earth-friendly gardening. And if you'd like to participate by purchasing a sign, the sign is shown here, you can do so on the Master Gardener's website. The sign is not required. You don't have to purchase it. It's just an option if you'd like to have that available and hang it in your yard to show how proud you are of your earth-friendly practices, and maybe start the conversation with your neighbors. This might be one tiny way that you could start a conversation with your neighbors to develop some of the corridors that Charles discussed in his previous slides. Now, we talked about just a few native plants, but guess what? There are thousands more. You can go to calscape.org, which is a website that was developed by the California Native Plant Society. You can search your home by zip code to find out what plants would typically grow in your area. And this is a great way to start. It will separate things by whether they're ground covers or trees or shrubs. And they also will talk about things like what animals they attract, where you can purchase them, and everything you wanted to know about any of those plants. So I hope if you're interested in planting some native plants that you'll check out this website and start planning ahead for that.
Wonderful. And then as you think beyond your own landscape, we just wanted to throw out a couple other websites and organizations that are doing similar work. homegrownnationalpark.org is one that I find very, very fascinating because it's a lot of what we're talking about here. It's a lot of, this trying to, the idea being, a large cooperative conservation effort that is driven by individual homeowners who have then made a commitment to create habitat on their property. So that's one website you can visit. Another one that takes that even more macro is rewilding.org. Their idea being, really finding ways to better integrate the needs of wildlife into just kind of again larger scale. They're talking about like our entire country, so the work that they do really looks at even things like the needs of large carnivores like mountain lions and our local wolves. And so again, these are these three websites are just websites that we that you could go to for some more information on kind of the both the plants that we were talking about today and the large palette of plants that we weren't even able to get to, and then kind of more about kind of the movements to support wildlife through your yard. And that, everyone, is the end of our presentation. We did want to allow for a little bit of time for questions, but doesn't look like we have a whole lot of time left. But I do want to make sure that we can do that. One thing I will say, I did see, Julie, that you had asked for this presentation. We will send a PDF of it to Shirley, and then we'll just ask if Shirley can distribute that to whoever wants it. And at this point, I don't know, let me ask, are there, Denise, is there time for some questions? Is Denise still on?
Hi, yeah, you can feel free to stay on since I made you a co-host. My shift is about to end right now, but feel free to stay on and answer as many questions as you would like.
Okay, wonderful. And I thank you, Denise. And I see that Nancy raised your hand. And I will say I do have to leave in about 5 minutes. I'm actually doing this from work. But Nancy, why don't you go ahead?
Oh, I just had a quick question. What time is the best time of year to plant California poppies?
Good question. I have an idea, but Marsha, I know you do yours from seed.
Well, I do seed, and I start, you know what, I will plant California poppies any time of the year. So I know that's not an official good practice answer, but I do throw seed out. If we're expecting a rain, I throw seed out. So Charles, what would you recommend from a more expert perspective?
Where else can you buy the seeds too? If we don't have seeds to put out, where can we get them?
Oh yeah, you can buy seeds at any of the local nurseries.
Oh, okay.
Most of the local nurseries will carry them. You can buy anything from a small packet up to a couple pound container. It usually has a little bit of a, it has seed and a distribution element to help get it spread around. Oh, okay. But any of the local nurseries will carry those.
Yeah. And just my preference, I like to spread my California poppy seeds around December. I think if I do it a little too early in the fall, then and if we have a particularly wet, this happened to me last year actually, if we have a really dry winter, then the young seedlings don't tend to make it into the spring. But if you do it a little bit later, then it'll be okay. I mean, the last strong rain that we had here, so I have some established, and as Marsha was saying, if you can kind of treat them well throughout the year, they will behave as a perennial. They look like a carrot, a really thick taproot that will sustain them throughout the summer if you can just give them a little bit of water throughout the summer. And then they come back very strong the following years. But yeah, I've got a bunch of little seedlings that came up that have just kind of self-sown. I don't do a whole lot of overhead watering, and I don't have an irrigation system at all. and they seem to be doing okay. And so I think I'm really keeping my fingers crossed that we get a little bit of rain in December, and then I think I'll probably have to clear some of those poppies out because I have a lot. They self-seed very well. And what I always try to do is then collect seed at the end of spring and then throw those out in some of the areas where I want them to establish themselves in my yard. Thank you, Nancy. Any other questions? Wonderful. Were there any things I wasn't watching the chat very closely? I apologize. But was there anything?
There was a question about an animal, dogs dispersing burrs.
Yes, that was one of the
very beginning
from Bev. Yeah, the idea being, the idea of having a wildling yard, right, where we're letting it completely go, right, is one thing that you can do. And if that does happen, then some of those kind of less desirables will come in, these things that you don't want your animals to interact with. Now, for me, I do have areas in my yard where the dogs just can't get to, right? And so, those things can be fine there. But, I'm also someone who, I am a gardener, and I am, my yard needs to look nice as well, right? I mean, like, I'm close to some kind of undeveloped areas, and that's all there for me to look at. But I want my yard to look nice and to accommodate some native plants. And so I will still get rid of some of these noxious weeds, particularly the ones that are gonna stick to my dog and get inside the house. And so I will continue to get rid of some of those and make every effort that I can to bring other natives into my yard. Marsha, do you have anything to say to that one?
Nope. I have a couple resources that I want to mention real quick. A couple books that I refer to on a really regular basis. I don't know if you all can see this. Oh, it's backwards. The Drought Defying California Garden is a plant by two local native plant specialists, Greg Rubin and Lucy Warren. They have a couple books out now, but we mentioned a few of the plants. They list 230 native plants that are low water use plants that will make a lush landscape. I also like to refer to a book called California Native Plants for the Garden by Carol Borstein, David Frost, and Bart O'Brien. This is also another book that I find very helpful, and it talks a little bit about a lot of different plants and a lot of different situations for growing. So I hope that those will be helpful. I'll type the titles into the chat right now so that you'll have those.
Great. And we will also put those, attach those with the PDF of the PowerPoint that we'll share with Shirley, and then we will also include our contact information. I highly encourage you all, if you are interested in this, to consider joining the Master Gardeners. The application process is kind of tedious, but and they only bring in a class every 2 years. But you will meet a lot of other people who have similar interests. That's how Marsha and I met, and we are constantly talking about ways that we can encourage people to get rid of their lawn. I think I saw somebody mention that as well, and then replace it with natives. And as you've seen in our PowerPoint today, there are just so many wonderful native plants that you can incorporate in the landscape here. And so I think on that, I will just thank you all for being with us today. Thank you for caring so much about native plants and our native wildlife. Thank you again for the invite to speak with all of you. Marsha, anything?
Thank you very much. I had fun and hope you all enjoyed the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.